Welcome, everybody. I know there's a few folks still logging in, but I certainly appreciate everybody that's here today. And this is our final seminar of the semester. Kara will resume our acoustic seminars in the spring semester, beginning the second Tuesday in February through the spring semester. But I'm especially excited for our speaker that we have here today, Dr. Susan Parks. And Susan, I appreciate you coming and joining our CARE community and our UNH community and sharing your science with us. We're gonna do a quick introduction, and then I think we can probably get started. So Dr. Susan Parks is an associate professor in the Department of Biology at Syracuse University. Her primary research interests are the behavioral function and evolution of sound production in animals, their perceptual abilities, and the impact of noise on their ability to communicate. She's been involved in animal bioacoustic studies since 1995, first as an undergraduate working on whale acoustic census data and male frog calling behavior with Chris Clark and Kurt Fistrup at Cornell, then as a graduate student focusing on acoustic communication of the North Atlantic right whale with Peter Tyak at Woods Hole. She earned her BA in biology from Cornell and her PhD in biological oceanography in the MIT Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution Joint Program in Oceanography. She then held a postdoc at the Cornell University Bioacoustics Research Program before starting as a research faculty at Penn State Applied Research Lab in 2006. She moved to her current position at Syracuse in 2012, and she's received numerous awards in her career, including the Office of Naval Research Young Investigator Award and Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers from the White House. She's served as PI and co-PI on several federally funded research projects through NOAA and through ONR and through NSF, studying acoustic behavior, hearing, soundscapes, and noise impacts on a variety of marine and terrestrial species. And so Susan today is going to share with us a talk called Who Says What? Acoustic Communication by North Atlantic Right Whale Mother-Calf Pairs. Thanks for joining us today, Susan.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation, and also for the flexibility when I switched from October to December at the last minute. So I appreciate everyone accommodating that change. So I'm happy to give a presentation today that's going to be summarizing work that my group has been working on for, I guess it's now getting on to about a decade, looking at acoustic communication in North Atlantic right whale mother-calf pairs. And so I first want to start by setting the scene to think about studying acoustics underwater, right? So a lot of you may work with terrestrial acoustics, and underwater acoustics is a little bit different. So first I want to play a clip from a sound that I recorded in my backyard this spring. And hopefully you could all hear that. And so that was just a cardinal that was singing in my backyard. If you're familiar with birds, you might be able to have an image in your mind of what that animal looked like. You can imagine a cardinal. He had his mouth open. I knew exactly what animal was producing the sound, and I could track him. I'm going to play another clip that is a recording from a passive acoustic recording setup that we have here near Syracuse. And so the acoustic environment in the terrestrial environment that we're more familiar with can also set the time. And so I don't know if anyone has any guesses for that, but okay, based on the owl, the coyote howling, and a lot of the crickets that we had in the background, immediately I knew that that was a nighttime recording. So even though I couldn't see the animals, I had a sense of the context and the place, and I had an idea of the different players and the different species that were making sounds because I'm familiar with the terrestrial environment. In contrast, this could be a sound that you might hear in the ocean off the east coast of the United States. And so this is really a very similar type of recording as the second one that I played. It conveys time of day, it conveys place if you're familiar with the players. And so in that case, there were some Atlantic white-sided dolphins and a humpback whale in the spring off of Massachusetts. And so humans are less familiar with the organisms that are making sounds, it's much more difficult to get a sense of which individual is producing a sound, even what species is making a sound. And so we're thrown into this less familiar environment. But the animals that are living there are going to be as familiar with those sort of soundscapes as you were with the example of the cardinal and of the coyote howl. And so really just putting yourself in context in the acoustic world of these animals and realizing even though it may be alien to us, it's sort of their everyday mundane experience is really helpful for me as I approach questions about why, who's saying what and why. So this is anyone who's seen any of my talks has seen this slide because I've used it forever, but it's really sort of a motivation of why study marine bioacoustics. Fundamentally, marine animals live in a very large ocean, and so they need to communicate over long ranges if they want to find each other. This is a sketch of a North Atlantic right whale. And in a lot of their habitat, their visual range can be limited to 2 to 3 meters. So this juvenile whale, for example, in many cases wouldn't be able to see its own flipper. Logistics aside of getting the flipper near its eye, the water wouldn't make it possible for it to see something that's more than 2 or 3 meters away. Acoustically, in contrast, to sort of lighten up the slide, to say that the ability to communicate acoustically is really sort of constrained by the background noise and the propagation environment, but there's potential for whales to communicate at tens or potentially even hundreds of miles or hundreds of kilometers apart in the environment. And so their ability to sense their space around them, the other species around them, and the other sound sources in the environment is a much bigger window than they have visually into their world. And so to me, this is sort of the motivation for studying marine bioacoustics and understanding the sounds that these species make. So the species that I've been working with for a while now, so 22 years, is the North Atlantic right whale. And so it's a large baleen whale. They're critically endangered. I've had versions of these slides that when I started, I got to say that there were fewer than 350 individuals. I got to update it and say that there were fewer than 500, and now we've had to downgrade again because there are fewer than 400 individuals left in this species. They're relatively easy to study because of their location, but this is also sort of a double-edged sword for the whales. Their habitat is in high human use areas off the east coast of the United States and Canada, and so they're migrating along a very urbanized coast, and they're interacting with a lot of human activities. And despite being protected from whaling since the 1930s, they still suffer from mortality from accidental vessel collisions and entanglement in fishing gear. This is an image of an individual that was struck and survived from vessel collision. This was a relatively small vessel. Larger vessels, the animals often have no chance of survival and will die. And then individuals, when they're feeding, they're baleen whales, they're filter feeders, so they'll swim through the water column with their mouths open. And if they encounter weighted lines, so lines that are anchored to the bottom, for example, they can get entangled and get these wrapped around their head. This can impede their ability to feed, and it has also been shown to put an energetic stress on these individuals that can cause a loss of energy that sort of really negatively impacts reproduction in individuals that survive carrying the gear. One really sort of interesting thing about these species, though, is right whales are huge. These are very large, massive animals, and healthy adult individuals are really only vulnerable, or adult individuals really aren't very vulnerable to predation from any natural predators. And they're really only vulnerable to predation as young calves. And so there are documentation of orca whales attacking right whales and other habitats, and also evidence of large sharks for this particular population attacking calves. Whether they're calves that were already weakened or dead is open to debate, but they do have predators on the calving grounds, and the calves are vulnerable. So a lot is known about right whale acoustic communication. Chris Clark, who I see is here, really started the understanding of the repertoire of right whales with a study of southern right whales in Argentina. And North Atlantic right whales are very similar in terms of their acoustic repertoire. There's a wide variety of low frequency call types that they produce, and I'll just play a clip from one of their social groups where a large number of calls are typically produced in a sequence. And they also produce a number of contact calls, commonly referred to as an upcall. And a number of studies have shown that there's the potential to discriminate individuality, so from different individuals, and potentially the age class of individuals from these calls. And I'll play the next example. I think the sound balance is a little off, so this one might be a lot louder in case you turned your sound up for the last one. So that's a pretty typical example of a contact call from a North Atlantic right whale. So because of their endangered status and because of their location off the east coast of the United States, there's a really large effort to figure out where right whales are and when they're present in a particular habitat area to aid in their conservation. And so this is done through two primary methods. One is visual surveys. In some habitats, they're vessel-based surveys. There are also aerial surveys in different habitats at different times of the year for this species. This is an example of an aerial survey off of Florida, which is the calving grounds in the winter months. If anyone's been following the news, there's relatively good news for right whales that there were 2 live calves born in the past week on the calving grounds in the Southeast. Acoustic detection is also used as a method for keeping track of right whale presence in a habitat, and really sort of the landmark example of this are the automatic detection buoys that are in the shipping lanes to Boston that was set up by Cornell University, where the buoys will detect the presence of right whale upcalls and alert mariners that a right whale has been detected within a 24-hour period. There are other methods of passive acoustic detection that are used in terms of either fixed sensors that are collected later to look at when right whales were present in a particular habitat. And there are also real-time recording units along the East Coast in different areas that are set out by different research groups to keep track of right whale presence using their sounds to detect them in the particular habitat area. So one thing that's really struck me is that the behavior of the right whales matters for their acoustic detectability. So visual surveys are pretty well understood. People have been doing them for a long time. The probability of detection and the spacing and the lines that you need for detecting a particular species can be calculated. For acoustic detectability, there are a lot of unknowns still in terms of whether a particular day or time or location might have the same detection probability of a right whale in the area as any other day, time, or location. And so one thing that's important to keep in mind is that behavior really matters for acoustic detectability. And so this is an example for a study that was published in 2011 based on digital acoustic recording tags that were deployed on right whales in the Bay of Fundy, which is up in Canada. It's a summer foraging ground for right whales in the early 2000s. And so from these tag deployments, we were able to see that in this particular habitat, which was a feeding ground, foraging behavior dominated the tag records. So the figure here on the left is demonstrating that over 120 hours of the tag data were foraging compared to travel, socialization, and rest, which were much less significantly represented. When we looked for acoustic calls that were in the record, the call rate per hour on the plot to the right shows you that the majority of whales that were actively feeding made 0 calls. And so almost all of the individuals when they were feeding had call rates of 0 during the feeding behavior. I sort of always joke that they don't talk with their mouth full. They'll make sounds when they're transiting between foraging events or between foraging areas, but actively foraging right whales are extremely quiet. And so it's really important to understand that the call rate is going to depend on the behavioral context, and understanding the behavioral context might change with time of day or habitat. And so using publications that talk about call rates for a particular species in a particular location need to be taken with a grain of salt, realizing that these things could be variable based on a number of different factors. So the question that really struck me was whether right whales mother-calf right whale pairs may have different acoustic detectability than other whales. And this was something that my mentors when I was starting had brought up as a potential that mothers might hide acoustically. This is not a new idea. People have suggested it for decades, that it would be advantageous for a mother who had a young vulnerable calf to be quiet, so it would be harder to find her. And so this behavior is referred to broadly as acoustic crypsis. And so just behavioral adaptations to reduce the conspicuousness of sounds produced by a particular animal. Lots of species do it. And so it's something that's fairly well studied, particularly in terrestrial organisms. And so there are a number of different ways species can do this. So the first one that had been documented is that they could produce sounds outside the hearing range of predators. So organisms that have specialized signals that are particularly high in frequency above the hearing of their predators have been described in a number of mammalian taxa. And then we also have invertebrate examples of that as well, where you're going to have sort of a shift of the signal out of the predator's hearing. Organisms can reduce the call amplitude, so they could essentially whisper to each other so that the footprint of their communication is smaller, and so they're less likely to be detected by predators in the environment. Or you could just fall silent. So if you can just wait to communicate, or there's a particular time of day that all the communication happens, these are all sort of methods and behavioral adaptations that organisms have been observed to use to reduce their acoustic conspicuousness for communication. So the fundamental question for driving this research was whether North Atlantic right whales show evidence of acoustic crypsis when the calves are young, because this is the time period that the calves are potentially vulnerable to predation. In other baleen whale species, such as humpback whales, mothers with calves have also been seen to isolate away from adult males or other whales in the population on the breeding grounds. And so the question was, did right whales modify their acoustic behavior? And this is important in terms of conservation related questions. So their behavior could make them more difficult to detect. The first thing that really also drove this study was the observation in a paper written by Michael Moore in 2004 that was summarizing necropsies from dead right whales, and the identification of the fact that 85% of the whales that had been brought to shore and fully necropsied that had died from ship strike mortality between 2001 and 2011 were either reproductively mature females, nursing females, or their calves. And so this really important subset of the population was disproportionately represented in this ship strike mortality. They are not the majority of the population by any means. And so I was also very curious whether the migration down to the calving grounds or the behavior of the mothers with calves or the adult females might be putting them at an increased risk for mortality from vessel strikes. So this is sort of setting the scene of the motivation for the research study into mother calf behavior. So the first study was really based on individual focal follows, where we would follow an individual right whale or an individual mother calf pair to try to understand their behavior. And so this project was really trying to look at the behavior of mother calf pairs from as close to birth as possible in the Southeast off of Florida and Georgia and the calving grounds. And so we would start by doing focal follows there. This is the team in the research vessel off of Florida. Lisa Conger and Dana Cusano ran a lot of that field work because I also had a calf of my own right when we were supposed to be starting this. So the first couple of years they're doing the lion's share of the field work. And so the Southeastern U.S. Field season was January through March, and then they migrated up the coast with the whales, collecting data in Cape Cod Bay off of Massachusetts in April and May. So after the migration, when the calf was a little bit older, and then also following up to the Bay of Fundy in August and September. So the foraging grounds, and also sort of the last expected known sighting of calves with their mothers before they were expected to be weaned. And so this study ran from 2011 to 2005, and it was these behavioral focal follows coupled with towed hydrophones from the vessel, just to hear if you could detect any calls in the presence of mother calf pairs. We weren't trying to localize the sounds in particular in this particular study. It was just to see if there was any sound detectable in the presence of mother calf pairs. So I'm going to try to run this video. So I apologize if it doesn't run well on your machine. I've been trying to get it over Zoom, but this is just an example of the kinds of data that we would see or the behaviors that we would observe on the calving grounds. And so the mother calf pairs often are resting in this particular habitat. And so the boat would be shut down and behavioral sequencing would be taking place of the mother and the calf behavior off the side of the vessel in the different habitats. So this really summarizes the data from the focal follows in this population. Right whales were having large numbers of calves in the early 2000s. And then when we started in 2011, it was the beginning of this sort of decline in reproduction in right whales. And so we had sort of decreasing numbers of mother calf pairs available each year. We were able to get 64 focal follows from 34 different mother calf pairs. So almost all of the mother calf pairs actually that showed up on the feeding ground or on the calving grounds in the Southeast, we were able to get some behavioral data from. And so just doing a breakdown of the behavioral sequencing of the activities of these animals observed just from surface observations on the vessels, where that about 75 or 76% of the time was spent in rest on the calving grounds. There was just a lot of sitting around with the mother and calf pairs. There was a little bit of traveling, a little bit of nursing, and very rarely would there be interactions between the mother calf pair and potentially other animals, or sort of rolling around at the surface with a calf with its mom, sort of labeled as social here. In contrast, following the same mother calf pairs up to the feeding ground, this is the data from the Bay of Fundy. And so we see a really big shift in sort of diversification in the behaviors of the mother calf pairs. There's still a lot of resting. So 44% of the time was resting, but there was a big increase in traveling. So sort of moving around at the surface, evidence of feeding on the part of the mom, unclear what the calf was doing from the surface observations, but they were diving down in the same places that their mom was feeding. And a lot more social activity with other right whales present in the habitat. So there was a big change in the behavioral repertoire of the mother calf pairs. The calf had gotten older on the feeding grounds, so the calves would be 8 or 9 months when we were collecting these data. So it was interesting to see this progression of mother calf pairs over the development of the calves, and the real change from the very, very sort of low activity levels on the calving grounds to much more active calves on the feeding grounds. So the problem is that most of the sounds that right whales and these mother calf pair sounds made, and most of the time when we detected any sounds, were only in periods when they were socializing or traveling. So if I just flip back quickly, remember social and travel, especially on the calving grounds, were a very, very small portion of their time. And so the overall behavioral context in which sound production is common was rare when the calves were young. And as they moved up through the migration into the feeding grounds, there was more of these activities where we'd expect higher call rates. And that's really what we found, is that there was an increase in acoustic activity of mother calf pairs as the calves matured. So this is another quick example of some of the calls that we could collect if we were not doing localization and we had calves coming up to the boat. So there was a quick little grunt there at the beginning. The boat shut down here, and the calf had left its mom and come over to the boat in this particular instance. And so this individual swam around the boat for a while, and he made a few calls while he was circling the boat. So here he's under the side of the vessel. And then he turned around and came back towards the bow of the boat where we had a hydrophone deployed. And so when he gets back to the bow of the boat, you'll hear one more vocalization, except that the video froze. Well, technology. So here's the same call sequence again. I will stop trying to play with video. So as part of this study, it was interesting to see how the calls changed with the maturation of the calf. And so the first clip I'm going to play is the spectrogram from the upper left-hand corner. This was when a calf was 1 month old on the calving grounds. So there were very strange, low frequency, garbled sounds. The second clip I'm going to play is from a calf that was 2 months old. The first call is from the mother, and then the 2 subsequent calls are from the calf. And so here we have a little bit more structure to the calls, but again, they're still sort of not something that we would associate with typical right whale calls from other habitats. And then this last clip are 2 contact calls produced by a right whale calf when its mom was off foraging in the Bay of Fundy. So by the time the calf was 9 months old, it was producing what would be considered a relatively typical North Atlantic right whale repertoire, a signal that would have been detected and assigned to a right whale in passive acoustic monitoring. But it did take the maturation of the calf for this to happen. We did detect some of these contact calls from calves on the feeding grounds in Cape Cod Bay, so 4 or 5 months of age. They weren't quite stereotypical right whale up calls then, but by the summer they were producing standard right whale up calls. So from this study, we were able to see that behavior and sound production was really tied to calf maturity for North Atlantic right whales. And so related to this concept of acoustic crypsis, a lot of it also seems to have to do with development of the calf and the abilities of the calf. So the behavioral activities change with an increase in active travel and socialization as the calf matures. And so there are more of these behavioral contexts where sound production is common. And also the sound production rates increased with the maturity and increasing separation distance from the mother. So we'd get more of these upcall, countercalling events between the mothers and the calves when the calves would separate. Separation was really, really rare on the calving grounds. We didn't see it very often. That example where we had the calf around the boat was notable because we could hear right whale upcalls in the distance as the mom came over to the calf, sort of rounded up the calf and swam away with the calf. And so that was the one instance that we saw a calf separated from its mom and the mom using these contact calls for the reunion. So the implications from this particular study was really for the visual and acoustic monitoring of right whales. So the mother calf pairs may be more difficult to detect. And so this could have play a role in this sort of increased observed mortality with the ship strikes. So more time was spent resting near the surface than other right whales. We have data from other age and sex classes on the calving grounds where you'll see a lot more social activity, you'll see more travel, and the whales are more conspicuous. And also the overall low call rates on the calving grounds suggest that passive acoustic monitoring for individual right whale mother calf pairs may not be very useful. So if there was a single mother calf pair present in the habitat, the probability of detecting her might be very, very low. This plot is just showing a summary of the average calls per hour of recording for the Southeastern U.S., which is the calving ground. So the average call rate was less than 1 call per hour from mother calf pairs with these focal follows. In Cape Cod Bay and the Bay of Fundy, it bumped up to 30 and 45. And this was in large part because of social interactions with other whales where you could get really, really high call rates over a short period of time during these interactions. And then also this caveat that calf call types are atypical in the Southeast and Cape Cod Bay. And so if you're using passive acoustics and you are looking for right whale calls, you should hope that the mom calls in these situations, because if you detected calf calls, you may not assign them definitively to a right whale. So the previous study that I talked about, we were studying mother calf pairs, and in most cases, the mother calf pairs were isolated. So in the Southeastern US, the water is quite shallow, often 30 feet or less. And so we're have high confidence that the calls are coming from the mother calf pair when we're doing the focal follows, because there are no other whales in the vicinity based on aerial surveys and visual surveys from the vessel. In other habitats, it can get more complicated because we have other whales present. And so when we were doing the acoustic behavioral recordings in social situations, we can't be confident whether it was the mother calf pair or the other whales they were socializing that were making the calls. In terms of passive acoustics and call rates in that sense, it still doesn't really matter because we're not talking about individual call rates, we're just talking about call rates in the presence of mother calf pairs. But if we really want to know what an individual whale is doing in terms of sound production, sort of the most reliable way to do that is to put an acoustic recording device directly on the whale. So this is a clip of an acoustic tag being put on a right whale calf. And so they're attached with suction cups to their back. And then we can recover the tag after it falls off of the whale and listen to the acoustic recording to get a perspective on the sounds that the whale was hearing and also the sounds that the whale produced. So this study was primarily in collaboration with Duke University. And so it was sort of a follow-on to the end of the previous study. So 2014 to 2016, putting suction cup acoustic tags on right whale mother calf pairs on the calving grounds in the Southeastern US, also trying to tag other right whales in the vicinity to compare to North Atlantic right whale mother calf pairs, so juveniles and pregnant whales in that habitat as well. And so the goal was to obtain dive data and then confirm the behavior and acoustic data from our focal follows that I was just talking about. And so that overlapping year in 2014 and 2015, we could also get behavioral sequencing data from the vessel to compare to the tag data to see how representative our surface observations were of the typical behavior. And so for this study, as I mentioned before, calving rates went way down starting in 2012. And so there were relatively few animals available for tagging for this study, but we were able to get 11 tags on mother calf pairs on the calving grounds and 5 tags attached to non-lactating whales, so 3 juveniles and 2 pregnant whales. There's an image here from a drone that was deployed by Michael Moore from Woods Hole. And so you can see a little white spot on the back of the mother, and that's one of the acoustic recording tags on her back. You can see the bottlenose dolphins off to the left. They definitely made the acoustic recording more lively. They had a lot of sounds that they were producing, and it also stimulated acoustic behavior from the mother calf pair as well. We had quite a few calls in this particular interaction. So all of the acoustic records were reviewed from these tags to try to figure out what the call rates were for individual mother-calf pairs and what types of calls they were producing. And so with all of these tag data, they're difficult to collect, and typically multiple people will go through them and will double check each other's work. And there was one particular whale tag that a number of us went through multiple times, and we noticed something weird. And so this is a spectrogram of 5 different contact calls. But I want to point out there's a little bit of sort of like a ghost of this broadband short pulse in each of these clips. And so this whale, for every single one of the contact calls she made, there was this paired sound that she produced immediately before the upcall. And so I'll play the clip so you can try to hear it. This is much lower amplitude than the call itself, so I play it multiple times for you to get a chance to try to hear it. So I mean, I suppose here for checking in to see if anyone wants to raise their hand if they could even hear that, the sound that's circled in the spectrogram. Uh-oh, nobody raised their hand, so maybe nobody could hear it. It sounds like the mouse click on your computer, right? It's as quiet as sort of just clicking your mouse. It's a very quiet sound. And the first few times we went through these tag records, we didn't think anything of it. We thought something was bumping into the tag until this record, because in this particular record, every time a louder sound was produced, this quieter sound was paired with it. Ironically, this whale is named Harmonia. So the little sort of grunt before each of her calls, I found ironic that she was named Harmonia. So when we started looking back through the records for those calls, we found a number of different call sound or types or sounds that were very similar to this paired sound that was repeatedly produced by Harmonia. And so we had some pulsed growl sounds that I'll play for you. So it's almost like a very quiet bubbling sound. And then these grunts, or paired grunts as we called them, which is a very, very short, low intensity broadband signal. They are not stunning. They're not even very interesting. And we didn't think they were intentional signals initially when we went through the data. And so once we went through Harmonia's tag, we went back through all of the tags that we had collected in the Southeast looking for these sounds to see if they could potentially be made in isolation rather than just being paired with these louder sounds. And what happened is that we found them on 8 of the 11 lactating female tags. And so they were extremely common on nursing female right whale tags, so mothers that were accompanied by calves, and they were very, very rare on all the other tag records. And so Harmonia was really the only other whale that we found them on. And so the call rates of these low amplitude signals, these very quiet signals from the mother calf pairs, ranged from 0, some of them didn't make them at all, to 30 an hour. And so we had much higher call rates than we had described in the towed hydrophone recordings from the behavioral focal follows. And these were sounds that we never detected in the behavioral focal follows with the towed hydrophone. I can barely hear them listening to a tag. I'm not sure all of you could hear them. And for the towed hydrophone, I don't think there would have been any chance of detecting these because we were following the whales at 100 meters or more. And so these were signals that we wouldn't have been able to detect without the tag record. And so the behavioral function of them, I think, is still totally open for interpretation, and whether it's sort of a biomechanical byproduct of just being a nursing female or whether it's an intentional signal, is something that we still are sort of trying to work out. So for the long range contact calls, like upcall production by lactating females from the tags, we had relatively low call rates of these upcalls. So we had less than 1 call per hour as the call rate for upcall production by lactating females. We had 1 tag that stayed on for 24 hours, and there were 0 upcalls or any tonal call of any high amplitude call type on that tag. So it is concerning that the mother calf pairs on the calving grounds are extraordinarily quiet in terms of the typical sounds we use for passive acoustics for right whales. It's not to say that they don't make them, they do. And when they're in the behavioral context of interacting with other whales, interacting with dolphins, when they're traveling, that call rate will go up. It's just the majority of their time is spent in this resting state where they're very, very quiet. The pregnant females and the juveniles, in contrast, had a higher call rate. Still not stunning, right? So we're getting on average about 3 to 4 calls per hour, but it's a lot higher than the mother calf pairs. I'd also point out too, our sample size is tiny. So working with an endangered species, particularly an endangered species on the calving grounds when they're having real trouble with reproduction, leads to really small sample size. So all of this needs to be interpreted with caution, because we don't really know what's typical because we have such a small sample size here. But we do have indications that the pregnant females and the juveniles have much higher call rates than the lactating females. When we looked at these quiet calls, so the pulses and the sort of bubbling growls, they were primarily only detected on lactating female calls. Those single pulses and double pulses were produced at an average of 6 calls per hour by individual whales. The pregnant females and the juveniles, we didn't detect this at all. So Harmonia sort of led us into these signals, but we were able to find them on the other lactating female call tag records for the majority of those tag records. I think the simplest way to really summarize this is these quiet calls, these very, very quiet calls that you can't detect 100 meters from the mother calf pair, make up 90% of the sounds we detected on the tags from lactating females. And the opposite was true for everybody else in the calving grounds. Almost 90% of their calls were these louder calls, and 11% of the calls were these very low amplitude call types between the 2 different groups. And so it is striking to me that there seems to be a big difference in the acoustic behavior of mothers with very young calves in this species on the calving grounds. Interestingly, sort of along in parallel, there were 2 groups doing acoustic behavior of southern right whale calves on 2 different calving grounds. So southern right whales are a closely related species, and there are multiple breeding populations in the southern hemisphere. And so there was a study led by Nielsen et al. That was published in 2019, looking at the call rates of mother calf pairs using tags in Australia. And then Julia Dombrowski had a tagging study in the calving grounds in Brazil. And so these 2 studies were looking at the calls per hour of recording, and they were only describing these higher amplitude tonal calls. And the sample size in Brazil in particular is small, but I was really struck by the similarity of these 2 studies. The published call rates for Australia and Brazil were between 5 and 6 calls per hour of these louder, high amplitude calls from the mother calf pairs. The Nielsen paper in particular talked about relatively low receive level of the calls on the tag, but it's difficult to do source level from a tag that's on the back of the whale. So I don't know if they're suggesting that the source level is lower than what we would find from a sort of more stringent source level measurement. I will try to play this video, but this is a video of right whales on the Brazilian calving ground carrying a tag. And here I'm very struck that the visibility is it seems to be worse than 2 to 3 meters in this particular habitat. You can see the dot of the tag on the back of the mother in the middle of the video. And these animals were in extremely shallow water, 5 to 6 meters of water. And so we were getting relatively higher call rates from these individuals than we were seeing for the North Atlantic right whales. So I think that that's something that's really, really interesting, because the density of whales on the calving grounds in these 2 habitats is different. Australia has relatively low density of mother calf pairs. Brazil had very high density of mother calf pairs on the calving grounds. North Atlantic right whales, most of the time, the mother calf pairs are very spread out, and so you're not finding individuals in the same habitat. So lots of interesting open questions in this particular area of the differences that we're seeing in different right whale calving grounds. So behavior and sound production seem to be tied to calf maturity for mother calf pairs. This is sort of the summary I gave before from the behavioral focal follows from the vessels. We get low call rates of louder tonal calls on the calving grounds and an increased rate of these low amplitude signal productions on the calving grounds. I should have said in the Brazilian study, like the timing of all these papers, the Brazilian study did also look for these paired pulse sounds and found these same very low amplitude pulse sounds paired with the higher intensity tonal calls. And so it'd be curious to look at the Australian record to see if those tags also have these quiet sounds. And there are other groups that are starting to look for these very quiet sort of grunty sounds from other baleen whales on the calving grounds. And there's tag records from a number of different species. So it'll be interesting to see if these sort of quiet sounds are more widespread and if they are potentially used to have individuals stay in touch with each other when they're very close together, right? So I had other people ask me before, right? Like there were definitely sounds that I made to my son when he was a newborn that I had never made before. And so there could just be a repertoire that is produced with young baleen whales that is useful for maintaining contact, but not revealing presence in these different species. So it's something I'm really, really interested in seeing how widespread this might be. So why whisper? So there are several potential hypotheses to explain this behavior, whether it's to avoid predators, whether it's to avoid other whales. But it does seem like there's evidence from multiple populations of right whales suggesting that mother calf pairs are often quieter or producing quiet sounds. This does have implications for passive acoustic monitoring. I know that passive acoustic monitoring does work in the Southeastern U.S. So there have been acoustic recordings, there have been detections of right whale calls in the Southeastern U.S. The question that I have is how many mother calf pairs might be missed if there's a very low density on the calving grounds, no juveniles or pregnant whales present. Would there be increased risk of saying no right whales are present acoustically when there's just a mother calf pair there? So that's something that does concern me. So we know that mother calf pairs have relatively high call rates on the feeding grounds. So beyond the sort of weirdness of the calf calls, I don't have big concerns about detection of mother calf pairs once they've migrated, but we don't really know what's going on during migration. And so the calving grounds are the real problem. So the question is, when does the transition to these higher call rates happen? And so this is, again, something that working with Doug Nowacek at Duke, we're trying to tackle is, do right whale mother calf pairs stay silent as they're migrating along the East Coast of the United States back up to Massachusetts? Or when do they increase their call rate? So do the mother and calf produce these higher amplitude calls when they're migrating? I think it'll be really important to try to figure that out for monitoring purposes. And so that's sort of the next thing we're trying to tackle. Unfortunately, relatively low numbers of mother calf pairs migrating at unpredictable times with relatively low aerial coverage makes it tough, but Doug's giving it a try this winter. So hopefully they'll be able to try to collect some data. So I think this all fundamentally ties back to the increased mortality of mothers and calves. If you go back through the news stories since 2011, a large number of the individuals that have been struck by vessels, including the latest mortality, were young animals or calves of the previous year. And so this increased surface and resting behavior and shallow diving is probably likely what's driving this increased risk of ship strike. Another that's anecdotal, not something that you can really publish well, is that when we were approaching mother calf pairs for tagging, the mother would always surface between us and the calf. We were always careful to try to keep the calf away from the vessel anyways, but the mothers would intentionally place themselves between the calf and potentially a perceived threat. That's a great strategy if the perceived threat is another whale or an orca whale. That's a terrible strategy if the threat is a large vessel. And so I am concerned that sort of natural protective behavior of the mothers may also put them at increased risk, but we don't really have sufficient data beyond anecdotes to say anything about that. So the low call rates and low call amplitude might limit the ability of passive acoustics to detect individuals though, so it's something to keep in mind. So the missing pieces of the puzzle, we have data from one habitat with really super small sample sizes of behavioral data. And so for those of you that study other species, I have a colony of crickets I've been working with, and it is delightful to be able to do parametric statistics and have a sample size. So I totally understand that this is a tiny sample size with a weird endangered species. So how normal it is, I don't know. And so that's why I'm curious to see similar behaviors from other baleen whale species so we can try to get to the bottom of this. But for right whale conservation, more data really are needed for long-term acoustic behavior. So we have recordings of up to 24 hours. That's not a very long window into the life of an animal. So what are they doing over a week or a month? We really need to know something about the migratory behavior and call rates. And then we also need to know something about the detectability ranges of their calls across habitats. As we have variable call amplitude, so we know right whales can modify the amplitude of their calls, and we have changes in the background noise. And so this footprint of detectability is going to grow and shrink depending on the habitat and the behavior of the whale. So it's complicated, but it's fun. So this is the acknowledgement slide. A lot of these data have been collected over the years with a lot of different collaborators helping with the development of tags and the tag technology and a lot of support and funding from a number of different agencies. And so this has been a team effort to collect these data. And I thank everybody who's on here as well who's helped with this study. And so that's it for me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them now. And also here's my email address and a link to my website. All these papers that are cited in here are available on the website.
Thank you, Susan. That was a really fascinating talk. For those of you that are with us today, if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat box and Susan and I will watch for those. We did have one question that came in earlier in the talk, Susan, from Carrie Seeger. And I think it was when you were talking about the changes in the call dynamics, from the calving grounds to the feeding grounds. And Carrie asked, does this change with maturation fit the definition of crystallization?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually more typical of mammalian vocal development in general. And so Holly Root Gutteridge wrote a paper that was using the entire archive of all the acoustic data we have from right whales from 1999 to 2018. And what we see is just a gradual improvement. They just get better at making the same sounds. It's not really crystallization. And the thing that's really surprising with the right whale data is that the duration of the calls get better or longer. The fundamental frequency gets more stable. So there's less nonlinear dynamics in the call as they get older. And with the records that we had, it just kept getting better and better. So it didn't stop at 6 or 7 or 8 when they might be physically mature. A female that was 35 was making cleaner calls with longer duration and better stability in their calls than a female that was 15. And so it's really sort of similar to what we see in humans, that vocal control with practice and age just gets better and better. So it doesn't seem to be crystallization. Yeah, that's a good question.
Thank you. Aditi's asking, with hiding mother-calf pairs, how much of the changes in detectability could be due to propagation conditions?
Yeah, it's a good question as well. So one sort of burning question in not just right whales, all baleen whales, right, is they have this major migration to calving grounds. And so there's been debates about why they do this. All of the calving grounds that I have gone to for right whales share terrible propagation characteristics for low frequency sounds, right? So Brazil, we're talking 4 to 5 meters of water. That's terrible. Like a couple hundred meters away, you can't hear it, even if they're in a social group. And in the Southeastern U.S., again, studies trying to look at noise exposure in the habitat, even though they're large ships, they're major shipping lanes in the calving grounds, you can't hear the big ships very, very well, even if they're only a couple miles away because of how terrible the propagation is. So yeah, I think that the acoustic propagation aspect of the habitat whether it's an intentional selection on the part of the mother or just a byproduct of bringing the calf to a particular area. But a lot of these calving grounds have terrible propagation. So it's both. But if it was just acoustic propagation, I wouldn't have expected there to be a change in the call rate unless it's just because of the behavioral state, right? So if they only make sounds because they're in a social situation that they need to make sounds and they're never in that social situation when they have a young calf, it's not surprising that they're quiet, right? So whether they're hiding or whether it's just a byproduct of just not socializing, like I'm not going to be out, chatting with friends if I'm by myself. So it's difficult to tease apart right now, I think.
Thank you. Thanks, Aditi, for that question. I was kind of along the same lines, Susan. You were talking about acoustic crypsis. And the other side of that story is the predation pressure that would result in the emergence of that in a system. So do you know anything about, predation regimes at the calving grounds versus the feeding grounds? Is there anything different there in terms of the pressures that would maybe lead to the evolution of this as a communication strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely lean towards, well, I would totally be asking people that are studying other calving grounds because one, this species is very strange in terms of the dynamics, just relatively low number of calves. So we have small sample sizes.
Yeah.
And also the status of the orca whales in the Atlantic is weird too, right? Like we have a few pods of these orca, but in populations in the Pacific, for example, and in the Southern Hemisphere, there are larger numbers of predatory killer whales that might be a threat to calves. So I think it's going to depend on the particular population. And so I don't know historically, someone else here might. I would guess that the predation threat from orca whales would have been much larger historically, and that it's declined recently. I think people were a bit surprised of the increased sighting of not orca whales, of white sharks on the calving grounds. So now the aerial survey teams see amazing things down there, right? And they see a lot of large sharks. And now with the satellite tagging of the white sharks, they migrate down from the Cape area down to the calving grounds, and they arrive there about the time right whale calves are being born. So whether that's coincidence or not, but I think it's just, there's such a small number of calves being born, the predation events seem really relatively rare.
Yeah, it's probably hard to capture that in the current population
But
dynamic.
if you think about the cost though, right? So these in this population, the calving intervals very poor, it's less than one calf every 5 years. Sort of in the healthiest populations, it's one every 3 years. So these are huge investments for the mothers. One of the weirder things I didn't talk about in the talk is that there's evidence that right whales might use acoustic identification for identifying their own calves, because now there have been 3 examples of North Atlantic right whales swapping calves on the calving grounds, which is a huge mistake, right? Like they're losing their calf and adopting someone else's calf and nursing it for 9 months. And so we've now seen this at least 3 times. And these swaps seem to happen in the first week or 2. And so it's possible that there's some time involved in developing acoustic recognition of the mom or the calf. Again, sample sizes are going to make it impossible to test that in this species, but it's really fascinating because in some cases it was different sex calves were swapped. And in some examples, there were calves that had like big white patches on their belly swapped for black bellied calves. And so it suggests that acoustics or some level of development in recognition of the calf is needed. So.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. We had another question come in, Susan, from Mara Polanka, who says, I'm studying humpback whale vocalizations and I'm trying to find a proper definition for sequence for data analysis. Do you define sequences in your case? If so, do you use a temporal criterion to define if a sound is part of a sequencer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. In the right whale cases, especially when we're dealing with call rates that are less than 1 call per hour, it doesn't become much of a factor. In their social groups, they have much higher calling rates, and sort of you could divide those into bouts, but it's not something that I've used a lot with right whales, right? Because they make so many fewer vocalization than humpback whales. We have a lot of humpback whale tag data from Massachusetts area, and we're talking like 1 hour of humpback whale tag equals 24 hours of a very active right whale. So I have empathy for you working on humpback whale vocalizations, but with their song structure that helps, right? And I think that's part of the reason a lot of research has emphasized the song, because it is very easy to define ways to parse up the song and to know when a song ends. With the social sounds bouts, unless they change call types, it's a lot more complicated.
So it sounds like some of the results from your study have been showing that these calf pairs tend to, in the calving grounds anyway, tend to kind of spend quite a lot of time at the surface being very quiet, which would seem to potentially be an adaptive behavior in the context of predation, like you were talking about. In the context of shipping traffic, though, that suddenly becomes maladaptive. And I'm wondering, you talked about you showed that one compelling picture of the whale that had the prop marks on its back. Are there any, and you showed one UAV drone photo taken. Is there any effort on the parts of shippers to use UAVs, maybe UAVs equipped with thermal cameras, to try to detect whales that are in shipping lanes, since they're not really making much, at least the cow-calf pairs are not making much sound?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of different technologies. I think I saw Dan Zitterbard on here as well, too, right? So, and there are a lot of sort of thermal and imaging and other methods that people are developing for using on ships. I think that those have a lot of promise. There have been efforts in the past also to try to use like active acoustics to detect whales in front of a ship. I think that would not work super well in this shallow habitat. Yeah, but it's definitely a problem that people are trying to solve. I think one of the challenges is going to be dependent on the density of whales. And, if you're trying to avoid the one whale you see and you divert, are you diverting into another whale? And so it does become a difficult problem unless you know what's in the entire water column in the three-dimensional space. So I think it is tough. There have also been efforts of trying to put I don't know if people are familiar with deer whistles. If you live in the Northeastern U.S., people use those for a while, right? I don't think they'd actually do anything, but people propose putting alarms right on ships and doing playback studies. Doug Nowacek was able to demonstrate in the playbacks of those types of alerting signals, it drove the whales to the surface, which you could see them, but it also is driving them up to the part of the water column where they could be struck by another ship. And so it's a complicated question of how we can improve our behavior and detectability of the whales without negatively impacting their behavior in a way that causes other problems. So.
Sounds like a bit of a catch-22.
Yeah.
Anybody else have any other questions at this point? I appreciate the great talk, Susan. It's been really, really informative and interesting. I think I saw one last question come in. Maybe you can answer for us. Let's see. If hunting brought their population levels down, why haven't they recovered? I read about other whale populations recovering to pre-whaling levels, such as fin, blue, pygmy, blue, minke whales. Why haven't the right whales? Like what seems to, I guess, keep them in a continuous state in terms of their populations?
Yeah, it's not a dumb question at all. And there are two species of right whales that are in really bad shape. So North Pacific right whales, the eastern population might be as low as 35 individuals in that breeding population, and then the North Atlantic right whales. I think it's fairly well understood from the reproductive side that there's a genetic problem. So they are very, very inbred. And so there's histocompatibility issues. So there are calves that, they're conceived and lost because the mother can't have them because of the genetic incompatibility issues. But then there's also an issue of prey availability that's really become very stark in the past 10 years, that essentially females just aren't getting fat enough to get pregnant. So the body condition, if you see a North Atlantic right whale and then you see a Southern right whale, and then pretty much everyone who gets into North Atlantic right whale research, right, the first couple of years, like, we should bring some Southern right whales up here and increase the genetic diversity, it'd be great. And then anyone who goes to see a Southern right whale would probably think we should catch all the North Atlantic right whales and get them out of the North Atlantic and take them to the Southern Ocean because they're so much healthier, so much fatter, so much less scarring and injury and disease. And so they're living in a sort of not great habitat. And then on top of that, we're hitting them with ships. So if the population could grow, if we didn't kill 2 or 3 or 4 a year with ships, and then if we also entangle them in fishing gear, that energetic cost, a large proportion of the population is shown to get entangled every year. And so if that is just enough of an increased calorie cost that a female can't get pregnant, or she can't get pregnant for 3 years because she was entangled, that all of those things, it's just all these little straws that are really holding this population down. And yeah, Southern right whales, most of the populations of Southern right whales have been showing good recovery. They have food availability and they don't have these other confounding factors. But But scientists are working on it. So when there was a reduction in the mortality, the population was growing, but can't fix the reproduction problem if it's food limitations. So.
It's a very exhaustive explanation of that. That basically circles back that there's a lot of reasons why, interacting reasons why this particular species seems to be at risk.
Yeah.
But certainly the work that you've done seems to have certainly revealed some especially important behavioral aspects that I think will go a long way towards helping understand their conservation. And I wish you well as you work through in the future, sorting out the biomechanics and the form and function of the quiet grunt that seems to occur in these pairs. I'm fascinated about how that's produced and what the signal means. So, Susan, I appreciate you coming and joining our care community this month and providing a talk. And for all of you that joined us today, we appreciate your participating over the course of the semester, and we look forward to having you all back in the spring when we start again with our spring version of the Care Acoustic Seminar Series. Susan, thanks so much, and I hope you have a great holiday season.
Yeah, thank you again for having me. And again, anyone has any other questions, I'm happy to follow up offline. So thanks very much.
Yeah, take care, everybody.
Bye.